There is a specific quality to an act of desperation that is also an act of defiance. Harry landed at Farnborough Airport at 11:45 in the morning, second week of March 2026, via private jet, a flight that had cost $150,000 and had consumed the last of his personal financial reserves, not the last of his accessible funds, not the last of his liquid assets before reserves kicked in. The last. He had spent everything he had left getting himself to the country he had left in order to ask the family he had spent years criticizing to give him money. The specific geometry of that decision, held up to the light, says everything about the position he was in and nothing he would want said about it. This was his second unannounced return to the UK in under a week. The previous visit had ended with a direct ultimatum from King Charles, delivered in a phone call at 9 o'clock in the evening on the 26th of February. Leave Meghan permanently and return to Britain with Archie and Lilibet, or seek no further family support. The condition was unambiguous. The deadline was implicit but understood by everyone involved. Harry had departed the following morning without meeting the condition or formally declining it. He had simply gone. And now, 8 days later, he was back, carrying a list. The list was detailed, professionally formatted, and represented the full accumulated financial consequence of 6 years of choices. It contained 5 separate items, each one a number large enough to generate its own headline, each one connected to the others in ways that compounded the damage of every individual entry. At the top, a $22.5 million IRS tax liability notice issued 10 days earlier for unreported income from Archewell and related ventures. Below that, a $10 million adverse costs order from the lost privacy lawsuit against Associated Newspapers, handed down by the High Court just days before. Then Archewell Foundation's $5 million operating loss in 2025, the Netflix production deal that had expired in December with no renewal, and $20 million in unsold, as ever inventory sitting in warehouses generating storage costs rather than revenue. Harry brought this list to a 45-minute meeting at Clarence House and presented it to his father. What happened in that room across those 45 minutes, what was said, how it was received, what Charles's face communicated before his words did, is the center of this story. But the answer to the question Harry brought to London had already been given 8 days earlier, in the phone call that issued the ultimatum he had declined to meet. The 45 minutes at Clarence House were the formal record of a decision that had already been made. And the advisory board that convened 4 hours after the meeting ended 12 senior palace members applying the consensus rule that Queen Elizabeth II had established in 2019 for exactly this kind of situation made. Sure, the record was not just personal but institutional. Unanimous, permanent, final. This is the story of the 3 days that followed Harry's landing at Farnborough, the meeting that ended his last realistic hope of royal financial intervention. The phone call from New York in which Meghan told him he was weak for going. The HRH controversy that broke on the morning after the advisory board voted and demonstrated in public and in real time exactly why the board had voted the way it did. And the flight home to Montecito, to a house with an IRS notice on the table, and a marriage conducting its own reckoning in parallel with everything else. The list he brought to London came back with him unchanged. Clarence House had not helped with a single line of it. To understand what Harry was asking for at Clarence House, you have to understand what the list actually contained, not just the numbers, but the specific nature of each obligation and how they related to the choices that had produced them. The IRS notice was the most immediately dangerous item. $22.5 million in tax liability for unreported income from Archewell and related commercial ventures, a notice that had landed 10 days earlier and that carried the specific urgency of an American tax. Authority that has identified a discrepancy and is waiting for a response. IRS notices of this magnitude do not wait indefinitely. They accrue penalties, they accrue interest. They generate the kind of cascading legal exposure that becomes exponentially more expensive with every week that passes without resolution. Harry was not asking Charles to pay this amount outright. He was asking for either a settlement loan or enough support to buy time while other arrangements were made. The distinction, from the institution's perspective, was academic. The $10 million adverse costs order from the Daily Mail case was the other acutely time-sensitive item. Harry had lost his privacy lawsuit against Associated Newspapers. The High Court had ruled against him and had done what courts do when they rule against a claimant in a case of this profile, ordered him to pay the other side's legal costs. The combination of the IRS liability and the adverse cost order produced, in the same 2-week window, a demand for $32.5 million against assets that sources close to the situation were characterizing as effectively exhausted. The Archewell Foundation, transferred to the Silicon Valley Philanthropy Group, had been completed in early March to avoid dissolution, a managed exit from an institution that had consumed $5 million in operating losses across the previous year and had no viable revenue path. The Netflix deal was gone. The as-ever inventory, $20 million worth of products sitting in warehouses, was generating costs rather than income. Personal funds had paid for the flight that brought Harry to London to discuss all of this. The detail about Archewell's transfer to the Silicon Valley Philanthropy Group deserves attention because it represents the specific way that institutional failure announces itself. A foundation whose stated purpose was charitable does not transfer ownership to an external organization when it is functioning well. It transfers ownership when the alternative is dissolution, when the gap between what it was created to do and what it is actually able to sustain has become large enough that the legal vehicle itself needs to be handed to someone with the resources to maintain it. The transfer had been completed at the beginning of March, 4 days before the Clarence House meeting. Harry had walked into that meeting having already lost the institutional vehicle that represented the formal infrastructure of everything the Sussex Post-Royal project was meant to build. The list was not just a collection of debts. It was the documentation of an enterprise in the specific late stage that follows the exhaustion of its structural capacity to continue. He offered one thing in exchange for assistance: a formal commitment to refrain from future media appearances discussing family matters, no more interviews in the spare register, no more public characterizations of family members, no more documentation of private grievances for global audiences. It was not a trivial offer in isolation. It was exactly the offer that Palace communications professionals had been hoping for across years of managing the fallout from what the Sussex media operation had produced. The problem, which William would articulate to the advisory board with a precision that left no room for counter-argument, was that the offer was only as valuable as Harry's ability to honor it. And Harry's ability to honor it was contingent on Meghan's willingness to honor it alongside him. And that willingness had been demonstrated across 6 years of evidence to be something that Harry could not guarantee, predict, or enforce. The offer was not worthless, but it was worth exactly as much as his control over the situation, which was not much. Charles's response to the list and the offer was confirmed by Palace sources in the hours following the meeting. It was not softened. It was not framed in the diplomatic register that Palace communications typically apply to statements about family members. It was delivered in the direct language of someone who has considered this moment carefully and has decided that clarity, at this point, serves everyone better than management. You chose your own path in 2020. You sued the press, published a book that defamed the family, and publicly criticized Camilla. Now you return asking for money. No, the royal family is not a bank to rescue you from your decisions. There was no preamble, no acknowledgement of the list's specific items or the genuine difficulty of the financial position it described. No suggestion that a different version of the request, structured differently or offered under different conditions, might produce a different answer. The answer was the answer. The royal family is not a bank. Harry had made choices. The choices had consequences. The institution was not responsible for managing those consequences on his behalf. Harry's response was the response of someone who had anticipated rejection and had prepared an emotional argument for the moments when the practical argument had failed. "I'm bankrupt and the marriage is falling apart," he said. "Meghan can't take it anymore. Don't you care about your son?" It was an appeal to the relationship rather than to the institution, the argument that a father's care for a son should override the institution's position on financial independence for non-working royals. Charles's reply was brief and contained something that was simultaneously care and finality. I care for you, but I cannot save you from yourself. Resolve it on your own. The care in it was genuine. Anyone who has followed Charles across the years of this situation and has paid attention to the specific pain that the estrangement from Harry has produced in him would recognize that the sentence was not performed. It was felt. And the finality was also felt, and was also genuine, and was the product of a conclusion reached after years of watching the same cycle produce the same outcomes and understanding that intervening in the cycle would not break it. The 45 minutes ended. Harry left Clarence's house. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the advisory board convened at Buckingham Palace and made the rejection institutional. What those 45 minutes had contained, beyond the exchange that palace sources confirmed, was something that neither of the two men in the room had asked to be experiencing, and that both of them understood in different ways and with different weights. Charles had watched this situation develop across 6 years. He had watched Harry leave, watched the book come out, watched the interviews accumulate, watched the commercial enterprise rise and begin to fall, watched the legal battles proceed through their various outcomes. He had maintained across all of it the position that the relationship mattered, even when the public conduct made that position difficult to sustain. The care in his reply to Harry's plea was not performed, but the finality was also not performed. They were the same sentence, I care for you, but I cannot save you from yourself, and they meant what they said simultaneously in both directions without contradiction. The care was real. The limit was real. They had always coexisted in the relationship. What had changed was that the limit had been reached. Harry left carrying what he had brought. The list was unchanged. The flight home would need to be arranged at a different price point than the flight that had brought him there. The 45 minutes had produced the formal record of where the relationship stood, which was not where he had needed it to stand in order for the trip to have served its purpose. He had known this was a possibility, had known it was the most probable outcome, and had come anyway, because the alternative to coming was to not have tried, and not having tried had costs of its own that he could not have lived with in the days that followed. The advisory board had been strengthened under a rule that Queen Elizabeth II established in 2019, requiring collective approval for major financial or protocol decisions involving non-working royals. The rule had been designed for exactly this kind of situation, a situation in which a family relationship and an institutional position might pull in different directions, in which a king's care for a son might produce a decision that the institution's interests could not support. The rule existed so that the king did not have to make that decision alone. 12 senior members, including legal and financial advisors drawn from the palace's permanent infrastructure, reviewed Harry's request and the terms he had offered in exchange. The board's review was methodical. They examined the specific items on the list and the specific terms of the offer. They considered the 2020 decree's explicit requirement for financial independence among non-working royals. They reviewed the history of Harry's previous undertakings and their outcomes. And they reached a unanimous conclusion before the session had run an hour. William's contribution to the board's discussion was the most extensively reported element of what transpired in that room, and it was reported because it was both blunt and accurate. His conditions are laughable, he said. Harry initiated the attacks on the family through lawsuits, books, and interviews. The public is barely interested now. His recent appearances averaged 4.5 million global viewers in February, down 60% from the 2023 peak. His credibility is minimal and his guarantees are worthless. He cannot control Meghan's statements. The last point was not a rhetorical flourish. It was the specific and documented reason why Harry's offer could not function as the quid pro quo it was presented as. A commitment to refrain from public statements about the family was only as durable as both Sussex's willingness to honor it. Harry had demonstrated across 6 years of situations that had tested this, that his influence over Meghan's public communications was limited in ways that made any joint commitment unreliable as a foundation for institutional support. Anne's addition was shorter and carried the weight of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said and was now simply confirming it. This is another attempt to exploit family ties. No assistance. Charles accepted the board's recommendation without dissent. The rejection that had been personal at 2 o'clock in the afternoon became institutional at 5. The 12-member panel, applying a rule designed by the previous monarch for situations like this one, had ensured that what happened at Clarence House was not a family argument with an uncertain outcome. It was a formal, institutional decision with a permanent record. While Harry was in the meeting at Clarence House, Meghan was in New York attending a public relations event promoting Omid Scobie's book. She received Harry's account of the meeting's outcome via phone at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time. The call's content, as described by sources familiar with its substance, was not the conversation of two people who were facing a shared crisis and processing it together. It was the conversation of two people who had been arguing about the decision to make this trip for several days and were now continuing that argument in the light of its result. The argument that had preceded Harry's departure had been intense and had involved a position reversal that said something important about the strategic calculation Meghan was making. She had previously urged Harry to apply pressure on the royal family for support, viewing it as a form of leverage, a demonstration that the Sussex situation was serious enough to require family intervention, which could be used to force concessions on other outstanding matters. By early March, she had reversed that position. The palace's hardline stance had made the likely outcome of any direct approach clear. The institution would not provide financial support, and the conditions it might attach to any assistance would almost certainly include Harry returning to Britain with the children under arrangements that did not include Meghan's participation on her own terms. The reversal itself was revealing. When Meghan had originally encouraged the approach to the royal family, she had been operating from the assumption that the institution's desire to avoid public conflict was a lever she could use that threatening to make the financial situation public or to characterize the family's failure to assist as abandonment would produce a negotiated outcome that included some form of support. By early March, the palace's conduct across the preceding weeks had made it clear that the institution had moved past the stage where that leverage operated. The Windsor blockade, the Operation Nightingale disclosures, the Royal Disciplinary Tribunal proceedings, all of it had communicated that the palace had concluded that public conflict was less damaging than continued engagement on terms it had not set. The leverage had evaporated. And without the leverage, the direct approach to Charles was not a negotiating tactic. It was an appeal to family sentiment. Meghan's assessment was that family sentiment was not what was governing the palace's decisions at this point. She was correct. Her statement to Harry before he left, "You're weak if you beg William. They will never accept us," was both a strategic assessment and an emotional one. And the two dimensions of it were in tension with each other in ways that said something about where she was. The strategic dimension was correct. The palace's position had hardened to the point where any approach was more likely to produce formal documentation of the rejection than any useful outcome. The emotional dimension was the statement of someone who knew Harry was going to go anyway and was trying to arm herself in advance with a characterization of the decision that would allow her to frame the outcome as his failure rather than their shared situation. He went anyway. He had decided that the crisis required the attempt regardless of its probability of success. He was right that the crisis required something. He was wrong, in the specific way that desperation produces wrong assessments of available options, that this particular something was the something required. Harry learned about the HRH controversy on the morning of the day after the advisory board's vote, through palace channels that had been monitoring the situation since photographs began circulating overnight. Images from a book signing that had taken place in February had resurfaced on Instagram stories, photographs showing the inscription Meghan had written in copies of Omid Scobie's book for friends. Love this story of resilience. HRH Meghan. The HRH designation had been explicitly prohibited under the 2020 decree. It was not a title Meghan had held since 2020, or had any basis for using in any context. Its appearance in a book inscription that had now spread across social media was not a clerical error. Princess Anne's public statement came at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was direct in the way that Anne's statements are always direct, not aggressive, not theatrical, but carrying the specific weight of someone who has assessed a situation and has decided that the appropriate response is a clear statement of fact. Meghan's use of HRH is a clear provocation. She knows the 2020 decree prohibits the title. This is not innocent. It is deliberate PR for her friend's failed book. We cannot allow continued exploitation of the royal name. The official notice to Meghan's lawyer followed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Her Royal Highness Meghan Markle must publicly correct immediately on HRH use. This violates the 2020 decree and affects royal credibility. No exceptions. Anne told Charles privately what she had been telling him for months in various configurations. Father is soft on his son, but if we are not firm now, they will keep exploiting. Harry must learn to take responsibility. The statement was the first direct public intervention from Anne on Sussex matters in considerable time, and its timing the morning after the advisory board's unanimous veto was not coincidental. The board had concluded the previous afternoon that Harry could not control Meghan's public communications. Anne's statement was issued in response to a piece of evidence that had appeared overnight, demonstrating that conclusion in public, in real time, in a form that required no expert analysis. The board had been right. Harry's guarantee had been worth exactly what William had said it was worth. The significance of the HRH incident extended beyond the protocol violation itself. The timing of its emergence surfacing as photographs from a February book signing began circulating overnight, becoming a public issue on the morning after the advisory board had voted, made it a piece of evidence that arrived in the public conversation at the precise moment when the board's reasoning was most available for illustration. William had told the board that Harry's guarantee was worthless because he could not control Meghan's public conduct. Within 18 hours of the board's vote, the public had a case study in the specific failure mode William had described. The efficiency of the illustration was not something anyone had planned. But the palace's communications team recognized it for what it was and did not waste it. The media coverage of March 5th built its dominant narrative around a comparison that required no elaboration to land. Catherine, Princess of Wales, holds the legitimate title Princess of Wales and does not use it in personal correspondence, preferring her real name in contexts where approachability and human connection are the appropriate register. Meghan, who holds no current royal title and whose use of HRH had been formally prohibited since 2020, had used the designation in a commercial book promotion context for a friend's publication. The contrast functioned as its own argument, not about titles specifically, but about the relationship each woman had to the institution, what that relationship meant to them, and what they believed it entitled them to. Meghan's response to the official notice and the public statement arrived at 10 o'clock that night, Pacific time. She posted an Instagram story, a photograph of herself holding the book, captioned, "Supporting creativity matters," that made no reference to the HRH designation, offered no correction, acknowledged no violation of the 2020 decree, and contained no engagement with the formal palace notice that had been delivered to her lawyer 8 hours earlier. The post remained live for 30 minutes before being deleted. By that point, screenshots had circulated to an audience large enough that the deletion changed nothing about the story's reach. The hashtag #MeghanFakeHRH reached 3 million posts by late evening. The non-response was itself a response, in the specific way that declining to acknowledge a formal institutional notice communicates a position as clearly as any direct statement. The 2020 decree had been accepted as a condition of the Sussex departure from royal duties. Its provisions were not ambiguous and had been reviewed and understood by legal counsel on both sides at the time of signing. Using the HRH designation in a promotional context and then declining to correct it when formally requested was a choice. The palace's formal record reflected that it understood the choice as such. Anne had characterized it accurately in her morning statement: not innocent, deliberate. The commercial consequences arrived quickly. Peacock officially canceled the Royal Spin series adaptation that Scobie's book had been positioned to support, a decision announced in mid-March that reflected the industry's assessment that the project's viability had been too compromised by the surrounding controversy to proceed. Scobie lost subsequent contracts and returned to freelance writing, with opportunities described as limited by people familiar with his professional situation. The book's sales figures, which had already been tracking below projections, did not recover from the association with the HRH incident. The promotional event that Meghan had attended in New York, which had been designed to generate positive coverage and expand the book's reach, had produced instead one of the most discussed royal protocol controversies of the year. Harry departed London for Montecito on the evening of March 5th. The flight home was not on a private jet. The personal reserves that had funded the outbound journey were gone. He carried the list back with him unchanged, every number on it, exactly what it had been when he landed at Farnborough 4 days earlier. None of it addressed, all of it now accompanied by the additional clarity that no address was coming from the direction he had attempted. The argument upon his arrival was the argument of two people who have each contributed to a situation and cannot agree, in the immediate aftermath of its worst development, on the allocation of responsibility for it. Harry's position was that Meghan had pushed him toward repeated confrontations with his family, had encouraged the approach to the royals for support, and then, when the approach became imminent, had withdrawn her endorsement and reframed his willingness to make the attempt as weakness. Meghan's counter was delivered in the specific register of someone who has processed the outcome of the Clarence House meeting and has conclusions about what it revealed. You're the weak one. You failed to secure anything. The exchange had the quality of things said in crisis that are partly true and partly the product of the crisis rather than the crisis's cause, accurate enough to land with force, distorted enough by the circumstances to be unfair in ways that neither person could fully assess in the moment. The specific thing that the argument revealed beneath its immediate content and beneath the two people having it was that the Sussex enterprise, in its 6-year existence, had been sustained partly by the presence of shared opponents. The palace's opposition to the Sussex narrative had given Harry and Meghan a common project, a common enemy, a common sense of purpose that had organized their partnership even as the commercial and legal and financial dimensions of that partnership came under increasing pressure. What the March 5th argument reflected was the specific difficulty that emerges when the common opponent has stopped engaging and the shared project has run out of resources. Without those organizing forces, the things that were genuinely different between them, the strategic calculations they each made, the risks they each assessed differently, the futures they each imagined became the dominant reality of the relationship rather than its background. Sources describe the marriage as having been in ongoing internal discussions about separation since late February, not dramatically ended, not announced, but structurally stressed in ways that the financial situation and the royal rejection and the HRH incident had each contributed to. The stress was not new. It had been accumulating across months of escalating pressure and declining commercial viability and legal exposure and institutional confrontation. What March had done was remove several of the remaining buffers, the possibility of royal assistance, the credibility of the guarantee Harry had offered at Clarence House, the commercial trajectory that the Scobie book promotion had been meant to support, and leave the underlying structural questions without the resources that had previously been available to manage them. The specific feature of the financial situation that made it unlike a straightforward debt crisis was the way each element made every other element worse. The IRS liability consumed the funds that might have been used to manage the adverse costs order. The adverse costs order consumed the funds that might have been used to service the IRS liability. The depletion of personal reserves to fund the Farnborough flight consumed the buffer that might have provided breathing room while legal options were explored. The Archewell transfer had removed the institutional vehicle that might have been used to restructure some of the obligations. The Netflix expiration had removed the revenue stream that might have offset some of the costs, The as-ever inventory, $20 million of product in warehouses, was consuming money in storage fees rather than generating money in sales. The $150,000 spent on the flight to Farnborough was the detail that illustrated the compounding most clearly. It was not simply that Harry had spent money he did not have. It was that he had spent it specifically to make a request, whose outcome was a refusal to provide the money he did not have. The journey consumed the resources it was meant to replenish, and the advisory board's unanimous veto ensured that the consumption was not a temporary setback to be overcome by a different approach. It was the formal institutional record that no approach would produce a different outcome. The compounding logic extended to the public narrative dimension as well, which was in some ways the most irrevocable form of compounding because it operated at the level of perception rather than finance, and was therefore harder to restructure than any individual debt. Williams' point to the board about the public interest numbers contained its own compounding logic. 4.5 million global viewers in February, down 60% from the 2023 peak. The Sussex operation's commercial value had always rested on the assumption that a global audience would remain interested in the Sussex story for long enough to justify the streaming deals, the podcast contracts, the book advances, the merchandise lines, and the speaking fees that were meant to sustain the post-royal enterprise. The audience had been there in 2020 and 2021 and into 2022 when the story was new and the conflict was at its most dramatic. By early 2026, the audience had declined to a level that could not support the cost structure the enterprise had been built around. The story had not ended, but the audience that had made it commercially viable had moved on to other stories. Camilla had attended a literacy event on March 4th, composed, public-facing, performing the institutional role that the day required, with the specific professional quality of someone who has spent 2 decades learning that the institution's continuity depends on the people inside it, continuing to do the work, regardless of what is happening simultaneously in other rooms, other buildings, other countries. The specific quality of that composure, the ability to show up at a literacy event and be fully present for it while a 45-minute meeting 2 miles away was producing the formal record of a family fracture, the quality that the institution has required of its members across centuries of exactly this kind of situation. The institution continues. The individuals inside it carry whatever weight they carry. The royal standard flies, the literacy event proceeds, the advisory board convenes at 4 o'clock. Harry's leverage, assessed at the close of March 5th, 2026, was the following: financial resources at 0, marital stability under active strain, family ties formally severed by the board's vote, public credibility at 4.5 million viewers and declining, the guarantee he brought to Clarence House rejected as unenforceable before it had been formally declined, and the HRH controversy now in the public record as evidence for the board's assessment of that guarantee's value. Charles's ultimatum of February 26th remained technically open. It had not been withdrawn, it had been confirmed. The condition was separation and return. Harry had not met it. The position Harry found himself in at the close of March 5th was one that contained no immediately available exits. The IRS notice required a response on a timeline that the institution had not agreed to extend. The adverse costs order would begin accruing enforcement mechanisms if it went unaddressed. The Archewell transfer had closed the philanthropic vehicle that might have provided some structural cover for restructuring. The Netflix relationship was gone. The As Ever brand was legally contested. The personal reserves were at 0. And the family that represented the only institution with both the means and the historical relationship to intervene had voted unanimously, through a formal process established by the previous monarch, that intervention was not appropriate. Every door that Harry might have moved toward had either closed or revealed itself to be a wall painted to look like a door. What remained was the situation itself, in its full dimensions, without the buffers that had previously made its full dimensions less visible. The two children at the center of everything had no knowledge of the list or the meeting or the advisory board's vote or the HRH hashtag or the compounding financial logic that made every available option slightly worse than the option before it. They were in Montecito. Their father had spent his last personal funds flying to London and back. Their parents were arguing about responsibility for a situation that had been produced by choices made before either of them had any say in anything. The institution that had rejected the request for financial assistance had not, in the same action, stopped being interested in their welfare. The custodial framework remained in place. The Hague petition remained sealed but available. The blue pajamas with the tiny crowns were still folded in the dresser at Kensington Palace. The institution had demonstrated, across the 3 days described in this story, that it had moved past the stage where managing the Sussex situation required active engagement. The advisory board's unanimous vote was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a formal procedure applied to a request in the ordinary way that formal procedures are applied, producing an outcome that reflected the documented record and the applicable rules. Anne's statement about the HRH violation was not an emotional response. It was a factual characterization of a protocol breach followed by a formal notice to legal counsel. The institution was not angry. It was operating. What remained at the end of these 3 days was the same question that had been present at their beginning, the question that Charles's ultimatum had put on the table in February and that the Clarence House meeting had not resolved in either direction. Whether Harry would eventually meet the condition, whether the conditions cost the marriage, the Montecito life, the post-royal project in its current configuration was one he would conclude he could pay. Whether the institution's patience, which had proven considerably more durable than the Sussex enterprise's commercial viability, would outlast the situation it had been waiting for. The royal family was not a bank. Charles had said so in the plainest available terms. What it was, and what it had always been, was something considerably older and considerably more patient than a bank. It did not need to collect. It only needed to wait.